Have you ever heard that Thomas Jefferson and Napoleon Bonaparte cooked up one of the most game-changing deals in history? Back in 1803, the United States, well, it was basically a fledgling nation. It had just started, and it was clinging to mostly the east coast of a continent that it really knew nothing about. For every American farmer trying to make a living west of the Appalachians, the mighty Mississippi, well, that was the only highway to their world. And the toll booth on that highway was the port of New Orleans. Here was the problem. America didn't own the port of New Orleans. First, it was actually Spain that had it, but then it fell into the hands of Napoleonic France, which was a heck of a lot scarier. And Thomas Jefferson, our third president, he knew this was a nightmare. He famously wrote, "There is on the globe one single spot, the possessor of which is our natural and habitual enemy. It is New Orleans." And of course, he was referring to France. He had to get that port. He was ready to drop $10 million. What he got offered instead would not only redraw the entire map, but force him to question the very foundation of his government and the foundation of his beliefs. Jefferson, he was a strict and staunch defender of the United States Constitution. In his mind, the federal government, well, the federal government had only the powers written down in that document. No more. No less, but no more. And nowhere did it say a president could just go out and buy foreign country or add land. So when this insane offer from Napoleon showed up, would he stand by his principles as a defender of the Constitution, or would he betray those principles in order to build an American empire and put the country on the road to becoming a global superpower? This, hence, was the dilemma. Picture this. We're going to go back a year. It's 1802. And Jefferson, well, he knows something has to be done. So he sends two of his best guys, Robert Livingston and James Monroe, over to Paris. Remember, it took a couple months at this point by boat to go over. But their mission was pretty simple. Buy New Orleans. They had a budget, and that was a cool $10 million. Not a penny more. It was a straightforward strategic play to solve one big nagging problem. But when they get there, Europe at this point is a powder keg about to blow. Napoleon Bonaparte, he kind of threw a wrench in a lot of things. The most powerful man on the continent, he's gearing up for another massive war with Great Britain. Napoleon's ambitions were just downright colossal, leaving him with a bunch of growing debts and desperate needs for funds. His war machine didn't just need fuel, it needed a massive and immediate infusion of cash. At the same time, his grand plan for a French empire in North America was already crumbling. The heart of that dream that he had, the hugely profitable sugar colony of St. Dominique, that was lost. There was a revolution followed by a bad yellow fever epidemic that had absolutely wiped out and decimated the French army that was sent there to crush that rebellion. Without the money from that colony, the massive Louisiana territory suddenly looked less like a prize, and it was more like a financial burden to Napoleon. It was expensive to manage, and it was a nightmare to defend all the way from France. Napoleon, at this point, he needed cash for his war machine. So when Livingston and Monroe came knocking, asking for a port city, Napoleon's finance minister hits them with a counter offer that, honestly, it must have sounded like a joke. They were like, forget New Orleans, how about the entire Louisiana territory? All 828,000 square miles of it. The new price tag, $15 million. You might be asking, why would Napoleon, the most powerful man in Europe at the time, just give away 828,000 square miles of an empire that was basically pocket change for him? It was pure cold-blooded strategy, actually. The Haitian Revolution had been a brutal and expensive lesson in the reality of colonialism in the Americas. Napoleon, well, that dream was over for him. He also knew when to fold a bad hand. Without Haiti funding that whole operation, Louisiana was just a giant chunk of land that its archenemy, Great Britain, could easily snatch up at any point in time. Selling it to the Americans solved three problems in one go. One, it gave Napoleon a massive and immediate injection of cash that he absolutely needed for his mounting war debts and also to fund his next campaign against Britain. The second thing it did is it offloaded a giant territory that Napoleon simply couldn't protect. The third piece, which may be the most critical in this story, he figured it would help build the United States into a superpower that would one day rival his greatest enemy. As Napoleon himself said, "I have given England a rival who sooner or later will humble her pride." Well, think about Livingston and Monroe. This was absolutely mind-bending. I mean, their minds must have been blown. They were authorized to buy a single town and were just offered almost an entire continent for only $5 million more than their max budget. The one thing that they had to consider is they had absolutely zero authority to say yes to it. And writing a letter to Jefferson to get his permission would also take months because you had to do it by ship. By that time, the notoriously impulsive Napoleon could have completely changed his mind. This was one of those things that it was a now or never gamble. Seeing the opportunity of a century, they took a massive risk. And on April 30th, 1803, they signed the treaty. They had just agreed to double the size of their country. You think that Jefferson would be popping champagne, but instead, he was about to have a full-blown crisis of conscience. And why do you think that was? The country was literally twice as big. So why wasn't Jefferson celebrating? Well, I'll tell you why. Because when the news hit Washington on July 3rd, 1803, it threw Jefferson into a spiral. He was in conflict. On one hand, this was a geopolitical masterstroke. It not only locked down the Mississippi, but it booted a powerful European empire out of the backyard. And it gave America what seemed like an infinite horizon to grow at the time. On the other hand, according to Jefferson's own beliefs, it was flat out illegal. Now, you gotta understand, this is the guy who built his entire career championing a strict construction of the Constitution. The idea that government can only do what that document explicitly says it can. The Constitution at this point is completely silent on the president having the power to buy foreign land. And to make the point, this wasn't just some legal technicality. This was a direct hit to the core of his entire political philosophy. He had spent years and years accusing his political enemies of stretching the Constitution's meaning to hoard more and more power. Now, he himself was the one being tempted to do the exact same thing, but this was a scale that no one had ever dreamed of happening. He agonized that a move like this would make the Constitution nothing but a, quote, a blank paper by construction. He'd been handed the keys to an empire, but the price was to sidestep the very document he swore to defend. We have Napoleon just waiting for an excuse to back out. So, how did Jefferson get himself out of this constitutional mess? His first instinct actually was pretty cool. It was to play it by the book. He literally and actually drafted a constitutional amendment to give the government the power to acquire territory. But his advisors basically told him there was no way this was going to happen. The process was way too slow. Napoleon, well, he wasn't going to sit around for months while American politicians debated an amendment. His cabinet, well, they pushed back really hard, arguing that the president's current power to make treaties was all the authority that he needed to make the deal official. So time was running out for Jefferson. The deal had to be done before Napoleon got bored and called it off. In the end, pragmatism beat principle. Jefferson made the call. He swallowed his constitutional doubts and rushed the treaty to the Senate. He basically was essentially gambling that the American people would be so thrilled with the sheer size of their new real estate that they really wouldn't look closely at the legal fine print. And you know what? As usual, Jefferson was right. On October 20th, 1803, the Senate swept up in a wave of public excitement, ratified the treaty 24-7. Jefferson's bet had paid off. The United States agreed to the $15 million price tag, but how does a young country, basically broke, afford to buy an empire? It's not like they could just write a check. Well, the deal was actually pretty cleverly constructed. The US would give $11.25 million directly to France, and the remaining $3.75 million would actually be used to pay off debts that France owed to American citizens. Here's where it really starts to bog your mind. The US government, they didn't just have millions sitting in a vault somewhere to give somebody. So to raise the money, the Treasury had to issue bonds, a pretty normal practice to raise money. But here's where the story takes, and this is crazy, this is where the story takes a wild turn. So get this, those American bonds were sold to two major European banks. The first of those banks, Baring and Company of London, and the other was Hope and Company of Amsterdam. So a British bank was helping lend America the money to pay Napoleon, who was then going to use that exact money he was getting to wage war against Great Britain. Like, this is movie stuff, but this is real. You can't make it up. The bankers, of course, they weren't doing it out of the goodness of their hearts, and they probably didn't know where the money was going to go. They bought the bonds, and they bought them cheap, and they were paid back with interest over time by the US government, making, of course, the total cost of the Louisiana Purchase much higher in the long run. It was this crazy tangle of global finance that bankrolled America's manifest destiny. The deal was sealed, and politically, Jefferson, if he wasn't already, he turned into a rock star. But what was the real price of this incredible expansion? In the short run, the Louisiana Purchase was a home run for Jefferson. His political opponents, the Federalists at the time, they argued against it. And really, they ended up looking weak and foolish. Jefferson, well, he was praised as a visionary who had doubled the country's size without firing a single shot. His popularity, well, it went through the roof. That purchase cemented itself as the greatest triumph of his presidency, in my opinion. But the real legacy is way more complicated. Let's be clear about something. Those 828,000 square miles, they weren't just empty land. They were home to dozens of Native American nations who were never consulted in the least bit. For them, this wasn't a land sale. It was the sale of the US government's right to take this land, whether by treaty or by force. It triggered a horrific century of forced removals, broken promises, and brutal conflicts. On top of that, the new territory was like throwing gasoline on the nation's most volatile issue. That issue was the issue of slavery. The bitter, decades-long fight over whether these new lands would permit slavery or not permit slavery, well, this would dominate American politics, leading to one flimsy compromise after another flimsy compromise until it all came to a head because they all failed, and it plunged the nation into the absolute carnage of the Civil War. So in the end, the Louisiana Purchase wasn't just some great real estate deal, although it was truly a hinge point in history for a lot of people. It was the consequence of European wars, a slave revolution in the Caribbean, and pure, raw American ambition. At the center of all of this chaos was Thomas Jefferson. He was a president that was caught between his most profound principles and the opportunity of a lifetime, and a deal that was too good to refuse. And so by setting aside his strict interpretation of the Constitution, Jefferson, well, he set a huge precedent for presidential power that's actually still debated to this day. The Purchase transformed the US from a string of coastal states into a true continental power. This was the fuel for Manifest Destiny, the belief that America, well, that she was fated to stretch from sea to shining sea. It created the room for the country to become not only an agricultural, but also an industrial giant, and eventually the superpower that we know today. But that superpower was built on a shaky foundation of constitutional doubt by Jefferson. And its growth, well, its growth came at a devastating human cost, accelerating the destruction of Native American civilizations and deepening the wound of slavery that would nearly tear the nation apart not too long in the future. It does remain as Jefferson's most celebrated achievement. At the same time, one could argue his most staggering contradiction. I want to thank you for listening, and if you want to understand the other great gambles and hidden stories that shaped our world, make sure you hit subscribe. Hit that notification bell as well. Let's get a discussion going in the comments. Do you think that Jefferson was a hypocrite for bending the rules, or a heroic leader that seized an opportunity and seized a moment? Let us know what you think. Want to thank you for watching Archives and Anchovies, and as always, I want to wish you a great day, a wonderful evening, and a pleasant week ahead. Thank you.